Now, we've got an election coming up on March 28. We know that the key issue is electricity privatisation. It's probably the only issue because so much of what Mike Baird's promising flows from the funding coming from that. Now, Mike Baird has a massive, massive majority, but even if he wins the election, the key is the upper house. We've said this. They need to win 9 of the 21 seats in the upper house. They won 11 at the last election. They need to win 9 so that they and Fred Nile can then get electricity privatisation. If the coalition falls short of those 9 seats, then the upper house may block electricity privatisation. Enter these so-called micro parties and the so-called preference whisperer, Glenn Druery. This is the man who has been providing information for the minor parties in the Senate and upper houses around Australia, and he's been very successful in getting people like Ricky Muir and others into the Senate. He had a meeting last Friday night with a lot of the small micro parties and giving them advice and suggesting that they are going to be pooling their votes and their preferences, streaming them away from the coalition in an anti-privatisation push. He joins us on the line now. Mr. Druery, good morning.
Good morning.
Glenn, thanks for joining us. How confident are you that you can get some of these candidates elected up on March 28?
Look, I should say cautiously optimistic. If anywhere in the country to get someone elected in the upper house, New South Wales is probably the most difficult place. In September 1999, we had some changes that were pushed through by the major parties to keep minor parties and independents out of the place, and it is quite difficult for them to get through. In fact, we have a similar system in the upper house. It's in a way similar to the Queensland lower house in terms of how people vote and allocating their own preferences, and we've just seen that minor parties were very successful in their strategies in Queensland. In fact, I could argue that minor parties actually cost the LNP government.
What do you say to people who say that you're actually putting roadblocks in the way of democracy, that you're putting these micro parties that are barely known by the electorate out there and putting them into the seat of power?
Well, I would argue that point and say, barely known. 5 million Australians voted for parties other than the majors at the federal election, and the trend is continuing. It is approximately 20 to 30% depending on where you go. There is definitely a thirst out there for people to vote for parties other than the 2 major parties.
It's very complicated, this, but the way it works is that a party might get a very small number of votes, say like Ricky Muir, and then the way the preferences are done, all of these micro parties swap their preferences, they stream through and end up gathering enough votes and harvesting enough votes to get them across the line. And you work this out and you work out very complicated how to vote cards. Is that essentially how it operates?
The answer to that is yes and no. That's how it operates at a federal level in the Senate. That's how it operates in a number of other states. But in New South Wales, as I suggested a few moments ago, we had changes in 1999 that effectively make it first past the post, and the voters have to allocate their own preferences in this state. So what you're referring to is commonly known as the group voting ticket, and we no longer have that in New South Wales.
Yeah, because the group voting ticket meant that those preferences were being distributed, but the public had no idea where the preferences they were allocating went. This way, they actually know where they're going, don't they?
Oh, well, yes, they allocate their own preferences.
Yeah. Isn't that a fairer way? If you have a preferential system, shouldn't you know where your preferences are going?
Oh, look, horses for courses.
It sounds like yes to me.
Well, no, I'm a firm believer that I don't like monopolies or duopolies, and effectively what we have and had around the country in states and federal parliaments is a duopoly between the Labor Party and Liberal Party and a couple of minor players like the Nats and the Greens.
Yeah.
And if we had that in life...
Sure, I understand the principle, but what you're saying here is that all of the people you're advising are opposing electricity privatisation. Is that right?
Well, that's not necessarily the case. No, it is the advice I've given the minor parties is if you are to be elected, then you have to either be a part of helping to stop the third Green be elected or the 9th member of the coalition, or there's simply not a spot for you. The issue of privatisation, I think, is a separate one. The first priority for the minor parties is one of self-survival, and if they get elected, well, there's got to be an opening. There's got to be a seat at the table, and as I say, if either of these other 2 are elected, there will not be a seat at the table.
I know you've said you're against duopolies, but aren't you the man with his fingerprints all over the paralysis that we're currently experiencing in our political systems?
What paralysis is that?
Well, we're looking at a lot of blockages in the Senate.
Well, look, I think that depends on where you're kicking the goal with this goalpost. There are many people out there who do not want our medical system to go the way of the US, who do not want our tertiary system to go the way of the US. Without the crossbench that we have, that's exactly what would be happening right now.
What are your politics, Glenn?
What are my politics?
Yeah.
Look, I guess I'd be a centrist in many respects. Some things a little left of centre, some things a little right of centre, but essentially I believe in representation and fair representation across the board. And I'll come back to this duopoly issue. We've had duopolies in our airlines and it didn't work. We have a duopoly now, effectively, in our shopping system with Coles and Woolies. And I don't want to see that in our political system. I don't see what's wrong with ordinary people getting a Guernsey and trying to do the right thing.
All right, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks for your call.
Glenn Druery, that's the first time I've spoken to him, the so-called preference whisperer. The truth is that if you can get, I think, 5-6% of the vote, you get a seat in the upper house. That's the way the system has now been structured in New South Wales. Anthony Green is the ABC's election analyst. He knows these things inside out and was pivotal in some of the changes in New South Wales to prevent people getting a handful of votes elected to the upper house. He's on the line with us now. Anthony Green, you've heard that. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, in the end, the changes that were made in late 1999 were beneficial to New South Wales, weren't they?
Yeah, people shouldn't confuse this with what's going on in the Senate. There are no preference tickets in New South Wales. The ballot paper looks the same. If you vote for a party, that's the only party you've voted for. If you want to, on the New South Wales ballot paper, you can go 2, 3, 4 parties above the line.
You distribute your own preferences. Under the federal system, you've got no idea where they're going.
That's right, but that doesn't apply in New South Wales. To get elected in New South Wales, if you've got 4.5% of the vote, you get elected. Now, because there's large numbers of people who don't make use of preferences and you get lots of votes that exhaust their preferences, you can get into the New South Wales upper house on 2 to 2.5% of the vote.
Pauline Hanson at the last election, I think, got very close, didn't she, with 2.5%?
She got 2.5% and just missed out.
Just missed out,
In 2003, the shooters got 2.1% and got elected.
Yeah.
So 2 to 2.5 is your cut-off.
Anthony, is it possible that Luke Foley could be the next Premier of New South Wales?
I think think it's more likely the government will get returned, but I do think that that some people have overcooked the poll results. The lesson that people should take from Queensland is that when an opinion poll is published, polls the poll for first preferences, which is your first preference vote. They then calculate the two-party preferred based on previous preference flows. People have been quoting numbers like 53%, 54% for the government. But if you take the lesson from Queensland, where there was an extra 3% added to the Labor swing based on preference flows, then a 53 or 54% calculation might only be 51 or 52. It may be closer than people realise because of the way the polls are calculated and published.
All right, if you had to put your money down now, right now, what would the outcome be?
Well, I'm not a betting man, but I think that the government should be re-elected. But they're selling a policy in the privatisation leases that they're talking about, which is inherently unpopular in the election. People automatically oppose that. So they're trying to get elected while selling a policy which instinctively the majority of the election oppose. And that's the tough task they've taken on. This is an election campaign where people are being offered a choice. People complain there's not enough difference in politics. You're getting offered a choice at this election. This is a policy-based election.
It is, and we should just explain, the upper house, there are 42. There are 21 elected each time. Last time, the coalition got 11. They stay there, so they need to get 9 so that they and Fred get 21 and can get power privatisation through. If they fall short of the 9, they could be in trouble, couldn't they?
Yeah, they have 8 up for re-election. The members up for re-election were those elected in 2007 when Labor won. There are 8 members. The coalition can get 39% of the vote. They'll get 9 members.
Yeah.
And with the no...
They need the 9, don't they? If they fall short of the 9, there could be drama.
Yeah, I mean, in the current parliament, they've had to get both the Christian Democrats and the shooters and fishers on side. And if you remember, we got those odd deals at some stage about shooting on national parks being traded off against sale of electricity assets.
Yep. All right. Anthony, good to talk to you as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anthony Green, the ABC's election analyst. It's worth throwing that around because I think it'd be interesting, that upper house vote.
I think this Glenn Druery is the most interesting character in Australian politics right now. He actually holds the power to knock over governments, and also their budgets. And as we're seeing right now with the Senate federally, he is a very, very powerful individual. And you can go around and say that you're against duopolies, but are micro parties a really good thing for Australian politics, or are they making our country almost ungovernable?